If you've been following my channel for any amount of time, you know that I love dungeon crawlers. This fusion of kind of RPG, tactics, and wargaming all rolled into one. There's just something about going into a dungeon, grabbing that loot, leveling up, and fighting a boss monster. So naturally, I'm constantly exploring different titles, adding different titles to my collection, but also looking at different rule sets, looking at, hey, this works in a dungeon crawler. This creates that moment. These rules, I see what they were doing. I see where they were going. It captured most of it. But what about adding this part in? And as, of course, I explore the different dungeon crawlers, I want to put this question out there from a board game design perspective. If we're doing a dungeon crawler, is a card-based, more abstract dungeon crawler more powerful, more able to deliver that feeling, that narrative, than kind of the tiles, miniature, furniture type dungeon crawler? Now, the visuals are a little bit different. So let's explore this idea. First thing with a dungeon crawler is the exploration perspective. This idea that I'm standing before a door, I open that door, and now it leads to some corridors, it leads to some monsters, it leads to some counters. As I'm navigating through a dungeon, there is an end goal. There's an end objective. Maybe it's to defeat a bunch of minions. Maybe it's to recover a lost relic, beat down a boss monster, or look, it's just a loot run. But this idea is, as I navigate through, internally I'm calculating in my mind, how much further do I have to go? Do I go left? Do I go right? And as I explore deeper into the dungeon, there's resource management, not only in leveling up, but do I want to pop off that healing potion now? Do I want to use that surge with this attack? I don't know, am I halfway through the dungeon or not? So the first thing, of course, is the physical sprawl of the dungeon. What we see with physical dungeons, maybe we should do that, like physical dungeon versus virtual dungeon. Physical dungeons where I'm laying out tiles, they might interconnect, or it might be like a hero quest system with fixed rooms. I'm physically building the dungeon as I go. Now, visually, this is fantastic. I mean, yes, this is the wargamer in me, but there's just something about putting out dungeon doors and dungeon furnitures and miniatures and building that narrative where you step back in the moment and you're like, hey, I'm in that dungeon. But in terms of replayability, once you've played through that dungeon and once you've discovered the aspects of it, the fact that you are physically laying out tiles or physically building rooms, if it's a uniboard, you've kind of been there and done that. Yes, I can replay a mission and deal with the monsters in different ways as part of a campaign, but putting that aside for a moment, the exploration perspective of it, that first time punch, that first time delivery system of a physical dungeon crawler game, yes, absolutely, delivers. Now we go to kind of a card-based or a more abstract game where you're building a feeling, you're building a narrative. I enter a new section of the dungeon. Well, I flip over a card that maybe describes what that is in the moment. There's this type of room, there's this type of actions, there's these type of monsters in there. I can print out, if I'm a game designer, I can print out more cards. I can print out more rooms, right? 10 tiles versus 50 cards in terms of a room, a number of miniature minions versus card monsters, a number of set encounters versus printing out cards for an encounter. This is the powerful side of a card-based game in that I can produce cards in a greater quantity, in a greater variety than I can physical dungeon boards and dungeon furniture. Now, that's the limitation in that isn't the idea. I mean, certainly you could build and build and build forever. It comes down to production costs, and it comes down to size, and it comes down to storage. So card-based games, the fixed mission where you have these random elements drawing from a deck, and this is before we get into expansions and other aspects like that, you can generate a lot more replayability. You can generate a lot more in terms of tactics and what you encounter. So if I've played through the mission, I was going to call it a mission, I guess it's a quest. If I played through the quest a few times, card-based gives you a lot more variety and a lot more to try out. Now, one of the things in terms of a dungeon crawler, in terms of replayability or different tactics, the characters, the heroes, the adventurers, whatever that's going to be, this has always been the traditional way to get more plays out of it. So if I play through that first dungeon as a barbarian, it's going to have a different feel than if I play through that dungeon as a mage or a sorcerer. So the first time through with the certain characters, and we all have our favorite characters to play, I know where the monsters are. I know where the loot is. I know instead of going left, I go right. But now if I play it through with a mage, it's a completely different character experience. So traditionally, dungeon crawlers, once you've been through them, the expansion comes in adding characters. Now on the card-based side, you have the same thing. I played through the dungeon. I'm going to play it through now with the barbarian instead of the sorcerer, instead of the mage. But that replayability scales much higher because of the randomness of card-based events, the randomness of card-based dungeons. Now, in terms of the narrative, this is where I think there's a question of just good enough versus you really need to nail this point. An example of that, of course, would be if I have monsters in a dungeon crawler, physical dungeon crawler, and I've got my miniatures, yes, I want the miniatures to be high quality. But if they're passable enough, it'll work because we've got the visuals. Likewise, on the kind of card-based side, since I don't have physical miniatures, I don't have a physical dungeon, I don't have physical components as in 3D, I need that artwork. You need that artwork to be spot on building the narrative. No generic artwork to pull that off. No just kind of text-only card with a little item. You really need to nail that. So when a player looks at that card, not only do they, whatever it's going to be, a monster, an item, a room, not only are they getting that feeling of it and the information, but they're able to build that picture in their mind. They're able to look at the outlay of the cards. So up here is the encounter card, the narrative. We've got some monster cards here. Although I'm not looking at a 3D dungeon, when I look at that, I need to be pulled in on that. And so the artwork, of course, everyone has their own personal opinion and personal tastes. But whatever that is for you as a game designer, that artwork has to pull that narrative in. It really, really has to build it. Two examples that I think work really well, and an example good and bad. Warhammer Quest, the card game. This was put out by Fantasy Flight a number of years ago. It's out of print, but there's still a ton of new old stock. Games Workshop took the license back over, squashed it, so it never really took off the ground. It's a card-based dungeon crawler. The artwork is a mix of new artwork and old artwork from Warhammer Fantasy, Games Workshop Warhammer Fantasy. And it just really presents and it really nails that experience so well. It just really works. You flip that card over as a monster or a location, and it really pulls you in. It's fantastic. Then we've got an example of Pathfinder, the adventure card game. Now, I'm going to knock this a little bit, but in full disclaimer, I love Pathfinder, the adventure card game. I love it. It works on a lot of levels. We'll put that aside. I've explored it, pushed that up to the archive here. But the first edition of Pathfinder adventure card game, Rise of the Rune Lords, which I love, the artwork is just kind of generic. It's functional. It works, but it could have pulled you in much better. Now, the revised Pathfinder adventure card game, the artwork has been updated tremendously, and it really, really works much, much better. So those are examples. Another example, it's not a card game per se. It's kind of an overworld adventure game, Skyrim. I mean, I love Skyrim. They pulled the artwork from the video games. Now, my thought on that was, did you not want to commission artwork new? Did you pull it in from the video game because you're trying to replicate that? Did you pull it in from the video games because that's what everybody knows and it was quicker? I'm not sure on the design decision, but you're taking kind of 3D graphics, printing it onto 2D onto cards like it's familiar, but I think it misses something. It misses a little bit. But that game makes up for it in the fact that you have some miniatures, you have a board. So this idea of examples of the artwork, if we're going a card-based dungeon crawler, absolutely needs to be spot on. A third point to consider. And this is kind of, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good, depends really in that moment of size. Size of it. A dungeon crawler is physical based with miniatures and monsters. They can get really big, really, really fast. And I like big games, yes, but there's setup, takedown, this and that, compared to, say, a card-based game, which has a much smaller setup, takedown, and footprint. Depending on where you are in that moment and what's going on, that might be better. So turning it over to my fellow board gaming enthusiasts, both have advantages and disadvantages. But when we think dungeon crawler, when you say dungeon crawler, I'm thinking miniatures and terrain and boards and tokens and counters and figures and everything. What about the card-based side? And what does that look like? And what potentially advantages does that bring literally to the table?